April 1945. While the smoke of global war still hung heavy over the Pacific, in the cold gray skies above the East China Sea, a small moment opened the door to an entirely new era of warfare. Aboard a PB-4Y-2 privateer patrol bomber of Patrol Bombing Squadron VPB-109, Lieutenant Commander James Patterson, a seasoned U.S. Navy pilot, quietly followed faint blips on his radar screen. At 15,000 feet, he and his crew could see nothing but ocean and clouds, only the weak, flickering signals on the cathode tube told them that somewhere below, a Japanese convoy was moving. No one aboard that privateer realized they were about to become the first humans in history to launch a weapon that could find its own way, that could see and that could kill without human guidance. Suspended in the bomb bay, cradled in a steel rack, hung two ASM-N2 Bat glide bombs, the Bats of America. These were no ordinary bombs, nor were they like the self-propelled torpedoes of Nazi Germany. Each Bat carried a primitive mechanical intelligence within it, an S-band radar seeker that could detect a target more than 30 kilometers away, an analog computer to calculate trajectory, and electrical servos to steer its control surfaces toward the enemy. Then came the calm voice from the radar compartment. Target bearing 045, range 18 miles. Patterson nodded once and pulled the release lever. The two Bats dropped free from the aircraft's belly, wings unfolding as they glided into the air. In that instant, what humanity would come to call an autonomous weapon entered the battlefield. The privateer banked sharply south, exiting the danger zone. Behind it, beneath the low clouds, the two bombs continued to fly, needing no instructions, no radio link, guided only by their own radar. And somewhere in the dim vastness of the East China Sea, a Japanese ship was sailing toward its fate, unaware that death was already on its way. 4 years earlier, the idea of a self-guiding bomb had sounded insane. When America entered World War II, the Navy urgently needed a way to attack from beyond the reach of anti-aircraft fire. For Japan's deadly 25mm and 40mm guns had turned low-level bombing into suicide. They needed a weapon that could be launched from afar, that didn't risk its pilot, and most importantly, that could find and strike a target without remote control. That challenge fell to the National Bureau of Standards, a civilian agency known for measurement science. Leading the effort was Dr. Hugh Dryden, a young but brilliant aeronautical physicist who would later become NASA's first deputy. Administrator Dryden knew he was not merely building a new weapon, he was laying the foundation for an entirely new principle of warfare, letting machines act, decide, and kill on their own. In laboratories across Washington, Dryden's engineers joined forces with scientists from Bell Labs and leading American universities. Together, they faced an unprecedented problem. How could a bomb detect an enemy ship amid the vast ocean, guide itself in flight, and hit without any radio control? The answer lay in radar, a technology that, only a few years earlier, had been one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. Heavy vacuum tubes, copper circuits, tiny mechanical gears, all were packed into a 3-meter-long airframe with a wingspan of over 10 feet and a weight of nearly 2 tons. At the nose sat an active radar seeker. In the middle, an analog computer, the mechanical brain. At the rear, servo-controlled tail fins. By March 1943, the first Bats were tested at Patuxent River, Maryland. The early trials were disasters. Radars failed, wings broke, circuits burned. Yet with each failure came refinement. Every component was redesigned. By early 1945, as Japan's fleet lay shattered, the Bat was finally ready to fly. April 28, 1945, skies south of Japan. In the cockpit of the privateer, Patterson and his crew had no idea they were making history. To them, it was just another long-range patrol mission, one of hundreds before it. But this time, their weapon required no pilot, no courage, no sacrifice. It needed only the radar echo bouncing off a ship's metal hull. At 15,000 feet, the privateer held course. Below, the sea stretched like a gray sheet of glass, no sign of life. Then the radar speaker crackled, 4 small blips moving, Japanese ships, target bearing 045. Range 18 miles. Patterson checked his watch and ordered, "Release 1 and 2. The bomb bay doors opened. A metallic hiss. 2 Bats dropped away, then steadied into smooth flight as if alive. No one on the privateer saw the impact. There was no thunderous explosion, no rising smoke column, no photograph to record the event. Only later did U.S. Navy intelligence confirm a Japanese patrol ship had vanished from the map. For the men aboard that ship, if any survived to tell the tale, death came from nowhere. No engine noise, no aircraft silhouette, no incoming shell, just a flash, and everything dissolved. In that moment, though no one realized it, war had changed forever. It had entered an era where humans no longer needed to see their enemies. An era where machines could choose life or death. Once, war had been inseparable from humanity, from courage, fear, sweat, and blood. The bat shattered all of that. It fought without emotion, without reason, without soul. It needed only data. From afar, one could see the collision of two worlds. On one side, Japan, a nation of samurai where honor and spirit outweighed life itself. On the other, America, the industrial power of the 20th century, where war was a problem to be solved by engineers, physicists, and manufacturers. For the Japanese, battle was a test of spirit. For the Americans, battle was a technical equation demanding an answer. In 1945, while Japanese kamikaze pilots hurled themselves at enemy ships, the Americans created weapons that needed no pilots, knew no fear, and could not die. One side fought with blood and soul, the other with circuits and radar. Together, they embodied the transformation of modern warfare. After that first strike, Navy Command summarized the results. Bat had hit its target from more than 9 miles away. The crew had already withdrawn before the enemy knew it was under attack. A small victory, but one of immense significance. The autonomous weapon had proven that war could be fought remotely, beyond human limits. No pilots had to fly into gunfire. No gunners had to die on deck. Machines could now see, hear, and decide. That was the moment when war ceased to be an art and became a science. In Washington, Dr. Hugh Dryden received the telegram confirming success. The young engineer who had never set foot on a battlefield merely smiled faintly. He understood that he had not just helped the Navy win a skirmish in the Pacific, he had helped create a new era, an era later known by many names, the age of precision warfare, the age of automation, or even the age of thinking weapons. And it all began on that day, April 28, 1945, when 2 bats plunged into the vast Pacific. The Japanese sailors aboard the doomed ship never knew they were the first victims of an autonomous weapon. None understood what had happened. They saw comrades consumed by fire without ever hearing an engine or seeing an attacker. And when the sea grew quiet again, war itself had changed. Forever. From that day on, the killer no longer needed eyes, the soldier no longer needed a gun, and death could come from tens of miles away, faceless, wordless, and inhuman. The world had entered a new age of warfare, an age of machines, radar, and the first sparks of artificial intelligence, an age that began with the metallic hiss of 2 glide bombs named Bat. A fleeting moment in the Pacific sky that changed how humanity has killed ever since. When the 2 bats plunged into the sea in 1945, humanity did not yet know that that moment did not merely close a war, but opened an era of machine intelligence, an era in which weapons no longer needed the guiding hand of a human. Yet like every invention born of war, the bat was only a seed. From it, later generations of weapons would learn to hear, to see, and to choose their own shortest path to an enemy's death. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the United States found itself between 2 worlds. On one hand, victory. On the other, a new fear called the science of war. In the silent corridors of the Pentagon, generals understood that while the global war had ended, another race had just begun, the race between human intelligence and the nascent artificial intelligence. They called it Project RAND. Out of that RAND project, America would incubate things that later became satellites, computers, the internet, and precision-guided weapons. In the immediate post-war years, the scientists who had worked on the bat were brought together. Now they were no longer building weapons to end a war, but preparing for a war that had not yet come, the war of the future. Dr. Hugh Dryden left the National Bureau of Standards to join the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the forerunner of NASA. He believed that if radar could teach a bomb to find a target, then computers could teach an aircraft to fly itself. At the same time, at MIT, Dr. Norbert Wiener, the father of cybernetics, published Cybernetics, Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. Wiener proposed a startling idea. Machines can learn to respond to the world much like humans do. He argued that if a machine is given a system of sensors, a signal processor, and a feedback loop, it could adapt, think for itself, and act. This was the first philosophical foundation for thinking weapons. Around that time, a young British mathematician, Alan Turing, was writing the earliest lines about the concept of artificial intelligence. His paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, 1950, he asked, "Can machines think?" For most of the world, that was a philosophical question. For the military, it was existentially strategic. If machines could think, they could decide whether to fire. Meanwhile, U.S. Navy engineers began combining the BAT's active radar with the ENIAC, the world's first electronic computer, weighing 30 tons and filling a large room in Pennsylvania. Their aim: create weapons that could compute ballistics, wind, altitude, and target heading faster than any human. Early tests took place at White Sands Missile Range, New Mexico. V-2 rockets captured from Germany were fitted with autopilots and radar seekers. They were called Lark, Bumblebee, and Gorgon, the BAT's descendants. They flew higher and farther and could adjust their trajectories in mid-flight, something the BAT never did. In those moments under the desert's fierce wind, the young engineers looked up at flaming skies and knew they were touching the future, the age of guided missiles. But thinking weapons were not just missiles. They were also the idea that humans could be removed from life-or-death decisions. In 1947, at a classified meeting in the Pentagon, an Air Force general reportedly said one short, haunting sentence: "We need an air defense system that can react faster than humans." That remark led to the creation of SAGE, the semi-automatic ground environment, built in the 1950s. SAGE was a vast network of radars and computers across North America, connecting hundreds of radar stations to command centers via cables and microwave links. For the first time in history, computers received radar data, calculated target headings, and ordered interceptor missiles to launch, all within seconds. Humans became supervisors rather than deciders. When a light on the console turned from green to red, the machine had already chosen the enemy. Throughout the 1950s, the Cold War drove the US and the Soviet Union to pour billions into smart weapon research. From winged bombs guided by television cameras to semi-active radar-guided missiles, everything aimed to reduce the human role. Behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviets followed a similar path. In Moscow, the Institute of Applied Mechanics began researching automatic response systems for the SA-2 surface-to-air missile. In 1960, that weapon shot down a U-2 reconnaissance plane over 20 kilometers high, ushering in an era of weapons that made autonomous decisions. Many American scientists grew uneasy. Norbert Wiener, who had launched cybernetics, wrote in a letter to friends, "I have created a monster. Machines can now learn to kill without learning to understand." He opposed applying machine intelligence to weapons, but the gears of war never stopped. Each invention came with the familiar refrain, "We only need it for defense." As in earlier history, defense too often became offense. By the 1960s, the U.S. brought thinking weapons to Vietnam. The AGM-62 Walleye, a direct descendant of the BAT, was equipped with a television camera in its nose. A pilot would lock the target on screen, release the bomb, and leave. The bomb would guide itself to the filmed target. Archival footage shows Walleye glide into bridges, decks, and factories with a chilling precision. Americans called it a surgical strike. On the ground, it felt like a faceless storm. In 20 years, from BAT to Walleye, humanity went from bombs that could find to bombs that could see. But something darker lay ahead. In 1972, at a California laboratory, General Dynamics engineers began testing a new idea: onboard microcomputers that processed inputs from multiple sensors, radar, infrared, and inertial navigation simultaneously. The result was the Maverick missile, the first weapon capable of automatic target recognition and lock-on. When a pilot pressed the button, a Maverick didn't merely fly, it selected the target's weakest point to strike, a tactical decision made by a machine. From then on, the term thinking weapon was no longer metaphorical. It became a real entity that could analyze, choose, and act faster than humans. By the end of the 20th century, this technology culminated in the Tomahawk cruise missile. Each Tomahawk carries a small computer with digitized terrain maps, a radar altimeter, and image-matching sensors. It can fly thousands of kilometers, navigate around mountains and rivers, avoid enemy radars, find its target, and strike without any signal from a human controller. Like the bat, it went to find its prey. Only now the prey might be half a world away. Looking back, it all began with a simple lab idea in 1943. Let the bomb find the enemy ship. From that idea emerged an 80-year chain reaction in which each weapon generation became smarter, more precise, and more independent. Today, when we speak of autonomous drones, AI in warfare, or combat robots, they are direct descendants of the bat, the first thinking bomb. In the Smithsonian Archives, a real bat sits in a glass case. Its dull silver paint and slightly curved wings making it look crude and cumbersome, an artifact of a distant age. Yet if you look closely, beneath that silver finish, the shape of the future is already visible. For 80 years, the world has been continuing the story. It began then. The story of humans granting machines the right to see, the right to think, and ultimately, the right to kill. When night falls over the Nevada desert, where the first bats were once tested, the wind still whistles through the mountain ranges. In that sound, one can almost hear the whisper of those glide bombs, heralding an era humans thought they controlled, but that in fact has slowly outpaced its creators, the age of thinking weapons. April 1945. The South China Sea was still burning with war. From the southern tip of Taiwan to the shores of Borneo, Japanese convoys were still moving in desperation, across skies now completely dominated by the Americans. But what they did not know was this. Their hunters were no longer human, but machines that could see, aboard U.S. Navy PB-4Y2. Privateers, the extended variant of the B-24 bomber, flew a new weapon known by its codename Bat-1. It was no longer an experimental prototype. This was a combat-ready version, fitted with refined control surfaces, a more stable radar seeker, and an improved warhead capable of ripping through a Japanese warship's steel hull. And together with those first bats, the East China Sea campaign would become the baptism by fire of the world's first thinking weapon. From their base at Tinian in the Mariana Islands, squadrons VPB-109 and VPB-123 took off under cover of darkness. Their mission, to hunt Japanese convoys retreating from Taiwan, Borneo, and Indochina, ships carrying oil, food, and reinforcements back to the homeland. For the U.S. airmen, it was the final hunt of the Pacific War. For the men aboard those Japanese ships, it was a voyage into death. On the morning of April 27, 1945, Lieutenant Commander James Patterson's privateer lifted off again, this time heading toward the waters between Hainan and Borneo. The weather was clear. Visibility was perfect. In the bomb bay, 2 bats were locked and armed. The 10-man crew knew they carried something the world had never seen before, a radar-guided bomb. Aboard the Japanese freighter Aguni Maru, sailors still believed they could escape American air power. Conventional bombs dropped from high altitude usually missed by hundreds of meters. They had no idea that the weapon now approaching them could actually see their ship. When the radar screen aboard Patterson's privateer began to flicker, he ordered the aircraft to descend. On the green display, a tiny blip appeared. Japanese vessel, bearing 120, distance 14 miles. Prepare radar homing bomb release. Target locked. The bomb bay doors opened. The wind screamed through the fuselage. 2 bats dropped away, spread their wings, and began to glide through the low clouds. Below, the Japanese crew heard no engines, no siren of diving bombers, only the sea's stillness, the whistling wind. And then a blinding explosion. 1 bat struck the Aguni Maru square amidships. Its radar seeker had automatically locked onto the largest metallic reflection in range, hitting it within mere meters. Seconds later, fire engulfed the vessel. Within moments, it vanished beneath the waves. It was the first combat attack in history using an active radar-guided weapon. And within days, more bats followed. On April 28th, another privateer spotted a Japanese convoy near the coast of Borneo. Among them was the oil tanker Atsutasan Maru, more than 130 meters long. 2 bats were released. The first missed due to radar interference, but the second found its mark. Diving at nearly 400 miles per hour from 10,000 feet, the bat pierced the ship's deck and detonated in the fuel hold. A massive black plume rose skyward, visible for miles. The ship was destroyed. In his logbook, the American pilot wrote just one line: "Bat locked. Hit confirmed." Subsequent missions proved that the bat was more than a technical triumph. It was a transformation in naval warfare itself. For the first time, ships could be attacked beyond the range of anti-aircraft fire, with no need for pilots to see the target. A classified report sent to the Navy Department read, "Extraordinary performance. Weapon operates autonomously. No ground command required. Target hit probability 50-70%. This is the future of naval warfare." Meanwhile, in the dying days of Imperial Japan, word of a mysterious ghost bomb spread among sailors. They called it Lei no Yuling, Kaminari no Yurei, the ghost of thunder. It struck unseen, unheard, only the flash and the thunder remained. A Japanese officer who survived the Borneo attacks later recalled, "We saw no plane, heard no roar, no alarm, just a streak of light like lightning, and the ship exploded. Perhaps the sea gods were angry, but it was not the sea gods. It was the first mechanical intelligence of mankind, taking steps down a path humanity could never turn back from." By mid-May 1945, VPB-109 missions expanded rapidly. From the coasts of Indochina to Palawan and the Makassar Strait, Japanese convoys vanished without ever seeing their attackers. One bat was even recorded hitting an escort ship from 20 kilometers away, a feat unprecedented in military history. The U.S. Navy realized it held a weapon far ahead of its time. Yet among its officers, a quiet unease grew. If today we let machines find targets on their own, will they choose them on their own tomorrow? Technical reports sent to Washington described how the bat worked. Once released, its tail fins stabilized the glide. The nose radar emitted signals and read the reflections. If the return signal shifted right, the control unit adjusted the rudder to the right, as if it understood where the target was. This happened 20 times per second, faster than any human reaction. Seen from the ground, the bat seemed almost alive, banking, correcting, and diving. No one then realized they were witnessing the prototype of the modern cruise missile. But war does not wait for technology. Just months later, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The remaining bats were stored away in crates. None of the pilots who had used them were mentioned in the victory parades. Still, in a dusty Navy warehouse at Anacostia, one report from April 1945 remained. At the top, a single line read, "Radar homing glide bomb. First successful combat use." Only 4 brief words, but they marked the beginning of the entire era of guided weapons. If you look at the wartime map, the bat's hunting grounds stretched from the western Philippines across the South China Sea to northern Borneo, Japan's last vital supply route for oil from Brunei and Balikpapan. When that line was cut, Japan lost the fuel to continue the war. And it was the bat, not submarines or bombers, that severed the Empire's final lifeline. The ships that burned like torches in the black waters of the South China Sea were both the funeral pyres of an empire and the first flames of a new age of autonomous warfare. After the war, the world nearly forgot the bat. Its name appeared in no textbooks, no major documentaries, no medals for the pilots who carried it. It was too advanced, too secret, and perhaps too unsettling. Yet decades later, the Navy engineers who built weapons like the Harpoon, Harm and Tomahawk all admitted, without the bat, we would not exist today. For it was in the skies over the South China Sea and Borneo in 1945 that mankind, for the first time, handed over the power to seek, select, and destroy to a machine. And in the fading twilight above those same waters, where so many ships and souls once sank, one might still hear echoes from afar, the soft hiss of gliding wings, the heartbeat of radar pulses, and the waves lapping against cold steel hulls. Because it was here, upon the still waters of the South China Sea and the coasts of Borneo, that the first thinking weapon truly went to war. Summer 1945. The Pacific War was reaching its end. On shattered islands beneath the dark waves, and in the skies thick with smoke, One truth had become undeniable. Japan was no longer fighting the United States with weapons of the same age. They were fighting with faith, willpower, and the spirit of Bushido, while the Americans had entered the age of thinking machines. After the Bat missiles trial runs over the South China Sea, the U.S. Navy began its evaluations. It was no longer just about a guided bomb. The entire American war machine had become an interconnected system of industry, science, and logistics. Meanwhile, the Japanese Empire was patching together what remained with bare hands and belief. In a nation drained of materials, energy, and technical exchange, the gap between them was not a matter of years, it was a matter of centuries. Let's begin in the air. In 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, it possessed one of the world's finest fighters, the Zero A6M. It was light, agile, and could outturn any opponent. But only 4 years later, the world had changed. The Americans brought Hellcats, Corsairs, and Mustangs, heavy metal machines with engines twice as powerful, equipped with radar, radios, and even radio beam navigation. At night, Japanese pilots were nearly blind. They had no airborne radar, no navigation aids. American pilots, by contrast, could shoot down enemies in total darkness, guided by invisible numbers and waves. In the sky, the difference was the light of radar. One side still trusted the human eye, the other let machines see for them. At sea, the divide was even more brutal. While Japan still relied on carriers, battleships, and conventional submarines, the U.S. had already crossed into the era of electronic and guided warfare. American submarines no longer fired simple, straight-running torpedoes. They used the Mark 18, electrically propelled, silent, and nearly undetectable compared to Japan's air-driven models. U.S. destroyers carried SG radar and advanced sonar, able to locate targets dozens of kilometers away, even through fog or night. Most Japanese warships, meanwhile, still depended on binoculars, sound tubes, and signal lamps. In the final battles of the Philippine Sea and Okinawa, they fired blindly into darkness, never sure where the enemy truly was. That was the difference between hearing and knowing. On land, the pattern repeated. At Okinawa, American troops advanced with SCR-300 portable radios, linking every platoon with artillery and air support. When pinned down, they simply sent coordinates, and minutes later, shells or fighter bombers arrived. The battlefield became a vast, coordinated network, the nervous system of modern war. Japanese troops, in contrast, still relayed orders by lanterns, whistles, or runners. A command could take hours to reach a unit, and by the time it did, the situation had already changed. At Iwo Jima, entire Japanese detachments kept fighting in isolation for weeks after headquarters had fallen, unaware they had been abandoned. It was not only physical isolation but temporal. One side lived in the present, the other trapped in the past. Yet the deepest and most painful gap for Japan was in technical thinking itself. Americans did not merely build a weapon, they built a system. A self-sustaining cycle of research, testing, refinement, production, and deployment, from the laboratory to the front line. Even the smallest discovery by an engineer could be mass-produced and fielded within months. When the Navy needed new radar, it formed the Radiation Lab. When it needed a guided bomb, the Naval Bureau partnered with RCA and Bell Labs to create the BAT. Behind every gun, radar, and bomb fin stood thousands of scientists, engineers, students, and workers. In Japan, however, technology was locked within the military, split between the Army and Navy, secretive and divided, cut off from academia. Brilliant minds like Yagi Hidetsugu, inventor of the Yagi antenna, were forbidden from working on combat radar. Talent was wasted, ideas buried, and research groups forced to handcraft components under blockade conditions. The divide was not only in machines, it was in how people thought about knowledge itself. When BAT appeared, Japanese commanders refused to believe it was self-guiding. They assumed American pilots were steering it by radio, or that it was pure luck. No one could accept that a machine might see and choose its own target. But truth does not need belief to exist. Salvage reports from sunken ships near Borneo and Hainan showed diagonal impact holes, inconsistent with a free-fall bomb. A Japanese naval engineer wrote in his diary, "If the enemy truly possesses such a weapon, then the war is already over, for there will be nowhere left to hide." And so it was. 3 months later, Japan surrendered unconditionally. Some say the war ended because of 2 atomic bombs. That is true, but those bombs were only the physical conclusion of the war. The technological gap was its spiritual conclusion. When the Japanese saw bat bombs and B-29s guided by Northern radar, they understood they had not lost for lack of fuel or food. They had lost because a new world had been born, a world where science commanded warfare instead of warriors. After the war, Japanese scientists gained access to U.S. technical archives. They were astonished by the level of detail. Every drawing, every process, from soldering radar circuits to tuning microwave frequencies to assembling the bat's wings. While Japan had drafted schematics by hand, the Americans already used primitive electronic computers to calculate trajectories. Within years, those technologies became the foundation of the post-war world: civilian radar, computing, satellites, and eventually the internet. The technological gulf between America and Japan in 1945 marked the boundary between 2 human eras, pre-electronic and post-electronic. Yet, in a twist of history, it was Japan itself that later came to embody the power of science and technology. From the ashes of World War II, the nation rebuilt, learning from the very enemy that had defeated it. The young engineers who once heard of the bat bomb from veterans became the generation of Sony, Toshiba, and Mitsubishi Electric. And in time, Japan became a master of electronics, radar, and automation. The root of that rebirth lay in the lesson of 1945. Willpower cannot replace technology, but technology, guided by intellect, can change the world. In August 1945, as 2 atomic bombs silenced the Pacific, the war was over. Yet if one looks deeper, it was the small bat gliding silently over the South China Sea that foretold the end. It killed few, but changed the way humans kill. It marked the moment when men no longer needed to see to shoot, to meet to kill, or to be present to win. By then, the gap between American and Japanese technology could no longer be measured in ships, planes, or soldiers, but in the milliseconds between detection and destruction. America needed thousandths of a second. Japan, whole minutes. That was enough to decide the war. Today, if we open a map of the South China Sea and look at the coordinates where the bat once fell, they seem like meaningless numbers on the ocean. But to history, they mark the frontier between 2 worlds, where World War II ended and the technological age began. So when we speak of the US-Japan gap in 1945, let us not think only of victor and vanquished. Let us remember what humanity stepped into from that moment on, an age where machines began to think and humans began to learn how to live with them. The war was over. Ships lay silent on the floor of the South China Sea. The islands, battered by storms of fire, stood quiet once more. Soldiers, victors and vanquished alike, returned in silence. Yet within that silence, a new era was beginning. An era in which machines would begin to redefine the nature of war itself. From the bat, the VT fuse, and the proximity radar, technologies that seemed like mere wartime experiments, grew the seeds of the modern world. They did not just change tactics, they changed how humanity understood control, intelligence, and survival. After 1945, the world would never look at war the same way again. If World War I had been the age of machines killing en masse, then World War II was when machines began deciding how to kill. When the bat bomb dove toward the sea, it needed no pilot, no human eyes on the target. For the first time, an inanimate object chose who would die. From that moment, the boundary between soldier and weapon began to fade. That was the true legacy of the war, both magnificent and terrifying. In the years that followed, hundreds of engineers from the BAT project and the radar laboratories were reassigned to new programs. Project Pelican evolved into radar-guided missiles. Project GLOM laid the foundation for long-range reconnaissance drones. Microwave technology, once designed to detect warships, became the backbone of television, satellites, and the internet. Within a few short years, the tools of destruction began serving life. A Bell Labs engineer reflected in 1946, "We built instruments to seek and destroy the enemy, but we can also use them to seek and understand the universe." From there, the world entered the age of radar, computers, and automatic guidance, things we now take for granted, all carrying the imprint of war. Yet behind that progress loomed a moral shadow. The Pacific War was not just the triumph of technology, It was the beginning of a crisis of conscience. When the first bat struck a Japanese ship in the South China Sea, no one on the bomber truly knew what had happened. They saw only a blip vanish from the radar screen, a distant flash, and the report, "Hit confirmed." No one saw the dead. No one heard the cries. No one faced the aftermath. Death had become anonymous, invisible, emotionless. At Iwo Jima, death had been intimate, within reach, amid smoke and blood. But in the age of radar and guided bombs, death became a number, a coordinate, a signal. And that, more than any invention, changed the soul of warfare. After the war, many pilots and engineers from the BAT project struggled with unease. One RCA team member later said, "When we saw the bomb find its target, we cheered. But when we realized it had found people, we felt cold inside." They began to understand that every technical advance carried an emotional retreat. Technology made humanity stronger, but also more detached from its own consequences. Still, history always moves in the tension between light and shadow. Without those steps, mankind would never have reached space, radar weather maps, GPS, or the internet. From the BAT, in just a few decades, came the Tomahawk cruise missile, capable of flying thousands of kilometers with meter-level accuracy, a direct descendant of 1945's radar-guided bomb. From the proximity fuse arose the entire generation of smart munitions, self-activating sensors, and later, the Patriot missile system. The same technology that once saved pilots from kamikaze attacks became the foundation for protecting millions of lives in the modern age. The world that emerged, built from ashes, was still shaped by human intellect. For Japan, the defeat of 1945 was a catastrophe, but also a turning point. From its pain came a hard-earned lesson. No nation could stand against science armed with spirit alone. And from that lesson, Japan was reborn. 2 decades later, it had become a technological power. From transistors to robotics, from cameras to automation. An American general remarked in the 1960s, "We beat them in war, but they beat us in peace." That was not mere praise, but recognition. The legacy of World War II lay not in who won, but in who learned more from losing. For the United States, BAT and other wartime innovations opened a new vision of warfare, the war of data. Not about who fired faster, but who knew first. Not about who was stronger, but who calculated better. That mindset gave birth to radar, guidance systems, the ENIAC computer, and gradually to AI and electronic warfare. From the radar waves over the South China Sea in 1945, it took only 70 years for humanity to create autonomous drones capable of selecting targets half a world away. Every path of modern military technology can be traced back to those dark, humid, smoke-filled days on the Pacific. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was not mechanical, but philosophical. When humans grant machines the power of life and death, when war no longer needs soldiers, when victory becomes nothing more than a disappearing dot on a screen, do we still know what we are fighting for? That question began with the BAT, the first bomb that could find its own target. And even today, in the age of artificial intelligence, it remains unanswered. In 2020, at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, a restored BAT was put on display. It sits quietly behind glass, beside an F-6F Hellcat and a B-29 bomber. Most visitors walk past without noticing. It is small, unadorned, without medals. But for those who understand history, it marks the beginning of everything. An old engineer, once a Navy serviceman, stood before it for a long time and murmured, "Without it, we would never have reached the moon. But because of it, we learned that technology has no morals, only people do." And perhaps that is the deepest meaning of the BAT's legacy and of the entire technological age born from World War II. Not to glorify war, but to remind us that every leap in capability demands an equal rise in responsibility. The smarter our weapons become, the wiser we must be. Otherwise, one day, machines may decide for us what victory means. As night falls over the South China Sea, the waves still wash against the shipwrecks of 80 years past. Somewhere in that salt water may lie fragments of a BAT, its mission long over. No radar, no signal, only rust and black sand. Yet its legacy endures in every microchip, every satellite, every algorithm that defines our world today. And each time an autonomous drone takes flight, Each time a missile finds its target without a pilot, the echo of 1945 sounds again, the faint hum of a bomb's wing, opening the age from which humanity can never return.